Before I wrap things up, I just wanted to clarify some things I've touched on, especially in the last few slides. So, a little while ago, I spoke about acknowledging white privilege. So, let's start there by clarifying what I mean by white privilege. White privilege refers to societal privilege that benefits white people over non white people in some societies, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. White privilege refers to the implicit or systemic advantages that white people have relative to people of colour. So, for example, it's the absence of suspicion and other negative reactions that people of colour experience within racism. White privilege dates back to colonialism and sought to protect white society and is, in a way, the legacy of white supremacy. Peggy McIntosh describes the advantages that whites in Western societies enjoy and non whites do not experience as an invisible package of unearned assets, meaning no one can see it and white people haven't earned it, but it's valuable and it's given to them alone. White privilege denotes both obvious and less obvious passive advantages that white people may not recognize they have, which distinguishes it from overt bias or prejudice. Cultural affirmations of one's own worth, presumed greater social status, and freedom to move, buy, work, play, and speak freely is all encompassed in white privilege. White privilege also implies the right to assume universality of one's own experiences, distinguishing others as different or the exception while perceiving oneself as normal. So I hope that clarifies what we mean when people talk about white privilege. Next, let's just clarify what is meant when we talk about implicit or subconscious bias. Implicit is also known as subconscious bias and is the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. So, for example, stereotyping is an example of implicit bias. Our implicit bias or stereotypes are shaped by our experience and based on learned associations between particular qualities and social categories. These include race, gender, sexual orientation, and a whole host of other categories. An individual's perceptions and behaviours can be influenced by the implicit stereotypes they hold, even if they are unaware they hold these biases or unintentionally hold such stereotypes, hence it being called subconscious. Implicit bias is an aspect of implicit social cognition. So, this is a phenomenon that perceptions, attitudes, and stereotypes operate without conscious intention. So, for example, you ever just had a quote unquote gut feeling about something? Well, that's your implicit bias at work. The existence of implicit bias is supported by a variety of scientific articles in psychological literature. So I hope that helps in clearing up what's meant by subconscious bias. Finally, let's just clarify what's meant when we talk about systemic racism. Let's start with the word systemic. Something systemic describes something that happens inside a system and affects all parts of that system. So, if a cancer is said to be systemic, that means it's present throughout the whole body. If you're describing how the cancer progressed, however, you would say it spreads systematically from organ to organ. Systemic can also be used to denote something that is deeply ingrained in the system, which helps explain why you sometimes hear it used in discussions about social or political issues, including racism. And finally, just as it says at the bottom there, the racism doesn't exist as a result of the system. The system itself is racist. So I hope that makes it clearer what is meant when people say systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.